Appomattox syndrome is a term coined by Civil War historian Gary Gallagher to describe a certain kind of Civil War historiography. Here's a clip from a 2013 lecture where he defines the term.
You start at the end of the story with knowledge of the two great outcomes of the Civil War, that is, United States victory and emancipation. And they seem inevitable. Why? Because they happened. They happened. All right, we know that's what's going to happen, so now let's work back and see how we get to Appomattox on April 9th, 1865. And we go back and we find these markers that seem to point toward Appomattox. It's absolutely the wrong way to try to understand history, not just Civil War history, any kind of history. Never, ever start at the end of the story and then work back to figure things out. Read forward. Read forward in the evidence, and you will find complexity and contingency far beyond what that other way of looking at the past allows you to find.
What Gallagher is saying here is that the idea of inevitabilities in history largely comes from reading history backwards, which is a terrible way to read any story. In this context, he's talking about the Union's victory in the Civil War, but it can also be applied to the Allied victory in World War II, or, as I will demonstrate, the territorial expansion of the United States. For a community based on a form of historiography that rejects the idea of it's inevitable because it happened, the online altered history community is currently suffering from a massive epidemic of Appomattox syndrome. For those of you suffering from this disease of the mind, hopefully this video will serve as a cure. Manifest destiny, often regarded as inevitable, could have been strangled at birth, and I'm going to explain how. A lot of counterfactuals regarding the Louisiana Purchase not happening involve Napoleon Bonaparte's decision to sell Louisiana, either via preserving French control over Haiti or hand-waving the decision away. Little focus is placed on America's decision to buy Louisiana. It wasn't merely Thomas Jefferson doubling the size of the United States with a stroke of a pen, especially since most of the Louisiana territory was controlled by Native Americans. Congress still had to ratify the treaty. Although control of the Mississippi and extending America's frontiers to the Rockies seemed like an attractive proposal, there was substantial domestic opposition. The Constitution doesn't exactly say whether or not the United States can acquire new territory. Article 4, Section 3 does allow for new states to be admitted, but that's not a concrete yes or no. Article 11 of the old Articles of Confederation did allow Canada to join, no questions asked if they ever chose to, but everyone else needed to go through the 2/3 majority for statehood. Some interpretations of the Constitution prior to 1803 argue that the borders established by the Treaty of Paris 20 years earlier were set in stone, with no power to acquire new territory. Although the idea of amending the Constitution to make the purchase possible was floated around, there were arguments that it wasn't necessary. In particular, Congress's power to declare war and the President the Senate's power to create treaties could allow for territorial expansion. In addition, the United States, as a sovereign nation, should have the ability to acquire new territory in the recognized methodology of any other sovereign nations, which would include purchasing land. Jefferson himself doubted the constitutionality of the purchase and initially wanted an amendment to make the purchase constitutional, but abandoned the idea when he was informed that any delays could risk the loss of Louisiana. The primary opposition to the Louisiana Purchase came from Jefferson's opposition party, the Federalist Party. The Federalists largely opposed the purchase because they believed it would harm their own interests. Since the party was centered around New England, new states carved out of Louisiana would almost certainly have voted Democratic-Republican and cut down on Federalist political power. Even Federalists who supported the constitutionality of purchasing Louisiana didn't want any of the territory to be admitted into the Union. Another aspect of the opposition to purchasing Louisiana came from the expansion of slavery. Many New Englanders opposed slavery on moral grounds, but the extension of the 3/5 compromise into Louisiana would further increase Democratic-Republican power. A constitutional amendment to exclude the 3/5 compromise from the territory was introduced in the Senate during the debates over Louisiana, but it never went anywhere. The situation faced by New England Federalists in 1803 could be compared to the situation faced by Southern slaveholders in 1860. Both groups saw their political influence in the United States on decline, and although New England never seceded, the purchase of Louisiana did fuel an on-and-off secessionist movement in the region that eventually died after the War of 1812. The successful purchase of Louisiana set an important precedent for the future of the United States. The nation indeed had the power to expand. Subsequent territorial expansion throughout the 19th century at the expense of Native Americans, Mexico, and Spain transformed the Republic, once confined to the Atlantic, into a great power willing to use its influence on a global scale. As I will demonstrate, had Jefferson's attempt to buy the territory failed, American history would have been radically transformed. The closest the Federalists came to blocking the purchase came on October 24, 1803, when a resolution from New York Representative Gaylord Griswold was introduced to the House of Representatives. The resolution demanded that Jefferson provide documentation related to Spain's cession of Louisiana to France in 1800 to examine whether or not France could legally sell the territory to the United States. Since the Treaty of San Ildefonso ceding Louisiana to France contained a stipulation that France couldn't transfer Louisiana to a third power, the House would have found the purchase illegal. Since the House was responsible for appropriating the money to buy the territory, it would have been able to block the sale of Louisiana by preventing the United States from paying for it. Had Griswold's resolution not failed to pass by a mere 2 votes, Napoleon could have involuntarily retained Louisiana. This would have created an important precedent for the future of the United States, that the borders established by the 1783 Treaty of Paris were permanent, with no constitutional way to expand them. 42 years before the term would even be coined, manifest destiny would have been killed off before it got the chance to live. So, what would a North America not dominated by the United States look like? First, the Lewis and Clark expedition would have never happened, since there would have been no reason to explore Louisiana if it wasn't part of the United States. Without expeditions to the Pacific Northwest, Britain would have been the sole power capable of staking any enforceable claims on the Oregon Country. There would have been no joint UK-US occupation, nor would the territory have been split along the 49th parallel north. Similarly, with no American presence on the West Coast, Alaska would not have been purchased in 1867. Britain had an interest in acquiring Alaska while it was a Russian colony, and might have purchased it from Russia while making diplomatic concessions elsewhere. But I'm getting ahead of myself. What would have been the fate of Louisiana had the United States not purchased it? With the War of the Third Coalition around the corner, the isolated Louisiana would have been easy pickings for the British to occupy. Would the colony have been returned to Spain? Probably not. Spain was an ally of Napoleon during the War of the Third Coalition, after all. In 1800, the British had drawn up plans to conquer most of Spanish-controlled South America, and attempted to conquer the Viceroyalty of Rio de la Plata in 1806 and 1807. More Louisiana-specific evidence is the fact that the invasion fleet that hit New Orleans at the end of the War of 1812 was transporting a full civil administration to rule Louisiana as a British colony should Pakenham have defeated Jackson. Speaking of the War of 1812, would it have still occurred? The Louisiana Purchase, despite its controversy, proved to be a big boost to Democratic Republicans and was a major reason Jefferson was re-elected in 1804. Had the Federalists experienced a political revival, or at least maintained control until 1812, there would have been no war since the party opposed war with Britain. What would America look like without the War of 1812? Well, the Star-Spangled Banner would have never been written since the Battle of Baltimore would have never occurred, meaning the United States would have a different national anthem. Andrew Jackson, without the prominence gained for winning the Battle of New Orleans, would never even become president. This would have meant no Indian removal, especially since there wouldn't have been anywhere beyond the Mississippi to put them. This doesn't mean that the genocide doesn't happen, but the development of the Deep South and the expansion of plantation slavery into the region would have been slower. Speaking of slavery, the issue of its expansion wouldn't have existed without any expansion to begin with, meaning the Civil War would have never occurred. This means that hundreds of thousands of lives would have been lost and the South wouldn't have experienced 4 years of devastation, but on the other hand, slavery would have lasted well beyond 1865 and may have even lasted forever. Of course, the constitutional restrictions on American territory doesn't mean that American immigration westward wouldn't happen. The major difference is that the breakaway republics common in the first half of 19th century North America wouldn't have joined the United States. Florida, which saw multiple breakaway republics form inside it during the early 19th century, could have become an independent nation or joined and expanded Canada. Texas, by contrast, even if it did break away, would probably have been absorbed back into Mexico due to its inability to survive as an independent nation state. This wouldn't mean that Mexico would retain its pre-1848 borders, as the British in the decades before the Mexican War had interests in California. Whether via purchase from Mexico or annexation during a European intervention similar to the one that took place in 1861 historically, Britain would have gained control over California. This British expansion across the continent and the encircling of the United States would have led to fears that Britain was trying to conquer North America and retake the 13 colonies. Relations between the United States and the British Empire would subsequently sour. If Mexico ever became revanchist, there could have potentially been a Mexican-American alliance opposed to Canadian hegemony. Whether or not a war would break out is difficult to say, especially since Europe and Asia would have experienced a century of butterflies, making it doubtful whether a world war would even occur, let alone what the sides would be. But that would take away from the point of this counterfactual. As I have demonstrated, the Louisiana Purchase was an important step towards the United States achieving global hegemony by 1991. Jefferson's decision, although not without its critics, opened the interior of North America to territorial expansion both constitutionally and practically. Yet a republic from sea to shining sea was far from inevitable. Had 2 votes in the House gone the other way in 1803, American superpower status would have been permanently averted. I'm the Counterfactor, and thanks for watching.